be having a hybrid kind of a presentation. I'll talk a little bit, you'll hear a little bit of clips from the podcast Amended, and then we'll have a discussion. It looks like we're going to be all together for our discussion as opposed to into breakout sessions. So we'll just have to sort of be polite to each other and be respectful of everyone's different perspectives and opinions. That's something I tell my students at the start of all of my classes, so I'll reiterate that here. So I'm going to start by thinking about Amended and talk to you a little bit about how this came to be and how I got involved in this project. The questions that came to mind when I was thinking about this: why me? Why am I doing this? And why a podcast? Why is a podcast the right way to do this in terms of talking about history? Well, as Gabriel said, I wrote a book about 5 years ago called Suffrage Reconstructed. And in it, I was really interested in the question of why the word male was used in the 14th Amendment to describe voters, for the first time introducing gender-specific language into the U.S. Constitution. And in that moment, in 1867, right after the U.S. Civil War, the use of that term, male, to talk about voters sent a very clear message that voters should be men and men only. So I was interested in then what were the consequences of that decision. And I started to look at how women's suffrage activists responded to that language. And one of the things that came out of that for me was the widespread adoption of racist rhetoric by a certain branch of the white women's suffrage movement to describe themselves as better voters than Black men. And so my book really grappled with these two questions: how are gender and race related in the battle for suffrage after the U.S. Civil War? That was 5 years ago. And in the meantime, I got involved with Humanities New York, which is the organization at the New York State level that's the equivalent of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Its mission is to distribute grants to local humanities organizations. So by the way, if you're involved with a humanities organization that needs some funding, go to the Humanities New York website. Their purpose is to fund programming for humanities work in various locations across the state. But they also provide public programming around humanities education. I joined the board a few years ago and have been really excited to be a part of this really engaging organization, especially in terms of getting history out into the world more broadly. So a couple of years ago, everyone involved in suffrage history was taking a look at 2020. And we were all thinking, hey, the 19th Amendment, it's going to be a big deal to commemorate this 100th anniversary. And one of the staff members at Humanities New York, Scarlett Redmond, said, hey, what if we did a podcast? Let's think about doing a podcast. And there was some good reason to think about podcasting as a way to engage in public history work. In particular, the Virginia Humanities has a very extremely successful podcast, Backstory. They just ended after hundreds of episodes. It's an incredible podcast. And so New York Humanities is looking at the Virginia Humanities and saying, maybe this is a really good way to do it. And there are a couple of other really great models that they looked at. New Hampshire Public Radio Civics 101 offers a really great sort of educational opportunity to sort of think about how does our political system work. So they use that as a model. And then Uncivil, which is a fantastic podcast from Gimlet Media about some of the unknown stories in the American Civil War. So we were sort of looking at all of those three, but also realizing, wait, what about women's history? Where are the women's history podcasts? There are a lot of podcasts out there. There are a lot of history podcasts out there, but there aren't a whole lot on women's history. In fact, very few. And so Humanities New York said, let's do this. Let's do a podcast. So they came to me and they said, hey, Laura Freed, do you want to be the boring historian talking to the other historians while we have a radio personality to become your co-host for the podcast? I said, sure. I like podcasts. Why not? So we did some recording with Riva Goldberg, who's our producer and is a fantastic co-creator of the podcast. And she and I worked really, really well together, and we sent some stuff to Humanities New York. And so they came back to me and they said, So Laura Free, do you want to be the host of the podcast? So it was really cool. My role evolved very rapidly. So Riva and I then began kind of co-creating this. We write the scripts, we talk to the historians, we set up questions ahead of time, we interview the historians together. It's really exciting. It was a little bit more than I had bargained for, I'll be honest with you. You know, the kind of podcasts I'd listened to before, I was kind of a fan of the Woodcase Pencil Collectors podcast. And on those kind of podcasts, people call each other up and they say, hey, you know, what are you drinking? What pencil are you writing with today? You know, what's your favorite office supplies? So, you know, kind of had that in mind. And what we're doing is so different. It's really, really much more labor intensive and much more carefully crafted. And I think it's important to do it in this way because when we're talking about history, we have to get it right and we have to take it seriously. So this has been just an incredibly rich experience for me, and I'm really, really honored to be a part of it. I've gotten to speak to some amazing historians and activists and writers, and am still involved in making more episodes, so have more people to look forward to talking to. And I'm happy to talk about that process too later on at the end if anybody has any questions. Just a little bit about our artwork that you see up here on the screen. We commissioned this artwork from an amazing artist, and she put into the image some of the historic figures that our episodes are centered on. So if you look at the center figure is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. To her right is Harriet Jacobs. Above her is Lucretia Mott. At the top is Mabel Lee. Over next to her is Gertrude Bonin, also known as Zikulasa, and below her is Rose Schneiderman. So when you see this graphic image, it's not just random people. These are specific historic women that we talk about in the episode. So the purpose of Amended is to help spread a broader vision of history tied to the women's suffrage movement, mainly because the history that we learn in school about suffrage is so narrow and it focuses on just such a few number of people, while the battle for suffrage was long, ongoing, involved thousands and thousands of activists, and that those activists were as diverse as America is itself. And so we wanted to be able to tell the broader stories. But before we did that, we had to sort of think about how did we come to know about the suffrage movement, and how do we think you all come to know about the suffrage movement? So what I want us to do sort of at our first discussion point is just talk about what did you learn about women's voting rights, maybe when you were in school, maybe if you were a curious person and engaged in your own independent work to find that out. I see a couple of professional historians here. Hi, Jenny. So nice to see you. How did you all come to suffrage? So for this part, feel free to just jump in to share something, share your screen, open your mic, tell us all, what did suffrage look like for you? And in particular, you can sort of think about these three questions. How did you learn about the suffrage struggle? What did you learn? And how does that sort of knowledge inform your thinking about the US moment right now?
Hello. Am I participating?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, go ahead, you're here. Hi, go ahead,
I
Charles.
do not know about my ancestor being one of the signers of the Declaration of Sentiments until 2002 when a long lost cousin called. And since then, I've been really jumping into this, and I've been become involved with Judy Wellman and Nancy Hewitt, and I have been doing a great deal of research and actually throwing a big net over people living back in the mainly in the before the Civil War. But I've really become involved in looking at suffrage, and I'm interested in, because most of my research has been before the Civil War, what happens beyond that. So I'm very much interested in what's going on in this class or discussion.
Great. So Charles has a really deeply personal connection to this that led him into greater research. Thank you for sharing that. Somebody else, how did you learn about suffrage, or what did you learn about suffrage?
Well, as an older person who did not grow up in the United States, I basically knew nothing about it at all until I moved to Rochester in 1980. Somehow I learned about Susan B. Anthony and also Seneca Falls. I really can't think exactly how I did. But what I learned was the sort of official narrative. And that has so much widened in the last, so say 10, 15 years, that keeping up with it is even hard now. And I'm also not officially an American historian, so I had to learn a lot in order to have much background in this at all.
Jenny, did you learn about the British suffrage movement? Was that a part of your childhood education?
No, absolutely not. Nor my university education either.
Wow.
Even though I went to an all-women's college, we paid no attention to women's history at all.
Wow. Wow, that's interesting, huh? Thank you. Thanks for sharing, Jenny. Somebody else.
Hi. So there you go. I got a new computer. My name is, I teach at several of the colleges, both online and offline, and one of the things that I do, I came at this in a different way because I've been a trained historian, and I don't want to get too into this, but one of the things that I came up with is sort of the startling look that I see in a lot of my students' eyes when I say, well, you have to understand that in the 19th century, the suffrage movement was also associated with things like the temperance movement and, what was the, oh goodness, it was temperance and another one, anti-slavery as well. And I think this kind of spawned what unfortunately, I've been so busy, I've tried to come up with some ideas for my students because they're always trying to come up with something to do as far as, being able to look for things that for an assignment that they have to do online. And one of the things that started to come up this year is I wanted to tie it in with some of the ideas of suffrage as well, because a lot of, even the very young women, they may get something about suffrage, in American history, but it's not very comprehensive, and of course, they don't, we, of course, Susan B. Anthony's up there, but for the life of me, I can't, Alice Paul, that's who it is. They do once in a while get Alice Paul, and so forth, but that's how, I kind of come at it this way, because now living in New York, I'm not a native, but I like living here now. And living in the Mohawk Valley, it's like, I want to kind of be able to, for those people around here, say, you can go to these places like Seneca Falls. It's not that far. It's, and I finally took my children there, both my daughters, in the summer as a historian, I got to do something historical. So, but anyway, I kind of came at it this way. And I think my interest has also been kind of piqued because I wanted to also, in a way, try to get my students enthused about things that, yes, there are, major events, but also, this is one of those events that involves so many people from so many walks of life.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for sharing.
No problem.
Somebody else. We have quite a few more minutes. We can talk about this. Maybe if you feel like pivoting, how do you think your knowledge or your lack of knowledge at any point about voting rights in America and its history for women, how does that sort of shape your thinking about U.S. history or about voting rights today?
Well, I think I understand much more about how voting rights have always been a struggle. Coming from England, where we don't vote that often to start with. It's not been something that was really at the front of my mind, nor was it something that I understood that people were excluded from. And excluded from with very malicious intent and for a long, long time. So as we come up to the current election and all the problems with the post office and all those things, it makes me very aware of how exclusions have worked and still are working.
Kind of to piggyback on that, I was going to ask a question because you kind of went into this earlier on, and one of the things that I thought was interesting is because I usually when I start a class, we start how the arbitrary lines are drawn. We have Reconstruction starts here. Well, as we all know as historians, it's not always nice and neat and piled up that way. But I thought what I thought was really interesting was. And I don't remember where I read it, so unfortunately, you know how that goes. The mind's the first to go, folks. And one of the things I thought was interesting was this very public split about 1866. And this kind of went along with what you were mentioning in the 14th Amendment with the inclusion of the word male. There was this very, very public split between Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass, of all people. I don't think they ever spoke again. I don't remember if that's true or not. But I wanted to know, I think this is one of those moments that you can kind of say this, and I'm wondering if that's something that I see it as something important because, in the modern era, modern 20th century, we can kind of document and kind of, we have visualizations for these very public splits, but I don't know if there's that many for that happened for that particular era. I haven't been able to find any. Of course, I haven't been actively researching either. But but I was wondering if that is something, if there are moments like that. That's one thing that I found in particular. That particular moment I thought was kind of very compelling, very interesting, and how does race become now a dividing factor within the suffrage movement, and how extensive does it become?
Yeah, I'm going to point you to episode 3 of Amended because that whole episode is about the tension that emerges, and we look at that moment through the eyes of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who's a Black woman, who's a poet, a writer, one of the best well-known public speakers in America at the time, and also an ongoing suffrage and temperance rights activist. So we use her to let her tell us that story. So I'd point you to that episode. For those of you who don't know about that, it's a moment of a division among white suffragists, but also between white suffragists and Black suffragists in terms of priority. Who should have the right to vote in a moment when it doesn't look like very many people are going to be included into the franchise? And racism emerges most publicly at that moment. Well, that offers me a really nice segue into my next little piece, and then we'll start hearing clips from the show. So thanks for your question, Mike. So for me, I grew up knowing about suffrage rights activists always. I can't remember a time that I did not know about them. My mom was an early feminist in the 1960s in the United States. She was a lobbyist for the Equal Rights Amendment in the state of Indiana. I can remember going to lobby with her, holding her hand and walking up the steps of the courthouse in the state of Indiana to lobby for the Equal Rights Amendment. So I had a coloring book as a little kid that had suffragists in it that I used to color. So they were just sort of part of my life, and I viewed them as heroes. They were personal heroes to me. So in high school, I started to do a little reading because I wanted to know more about my heroes, and I came across some of the explicitly horrifically racist stuff that Stanton, in particular, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that's who you're seeing here, that she wrote in that period of schism, in that 1860s period where the white suffragists like her and Anthony came together and argued for their own voting rights on the basis of their whiteness. And as a teenager, I was horrified. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't wrap my brain around that as a young white person. And so grappling with that became my dissertation, and became, that was my story. That was my window into the suffrage movement and into the history. And that window made me realize how very little we actually know, right? How very little bit of the story that gets told. And it gets told in such a triumphant way, and in such a way that centers the white women in the movement, and that centers their needs and their interests. I imagine that since those of you are in the Rochester area, this is the person you're probably most familiar with in terms of suffrage. Somebody shout out who this is if you know. Nobody knows? All right, maybe this will help you out. How about that? Do you know this person? Who's that?
Susan B. Anthony.
There we go. That's
Yes,
Susan B. Anthony.
The previous picture is not one you see very much.
Very flattering.
Yeah, this is her as a younger woman.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't it interesting? Very few people can identify Anthony by that picture. So yeah.
I've always seen the
Go ahead, Charles.
one with her head on.
Yeah, yeah. So I assume that we know a lot about Stanton, and we know a lot about Anthony, but there are pieces of their story that we don't know, and that's what our next clips are going to grapple with. For the first clip I'm going to play for you is me, and it's me in Seneca Falls. Maybe a lot of you have been there. Mike, we know, took his daughters. I'm sure Charles has been there to see his ancestor's name on the wall. I've been there more times than I can count. And it's been really fun to go back there and look at it with fresh eyes. So the clip you're about to hear is me talking about the Declaration of Sentiments in particular. And in case you don't know, the Declaration of Sentiments was a document that was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the other organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention to serve as sort of a women's rights manifesto. And it's memorialized in Seneca Falls in a particular way, and you're going to hear about that in just a minute. Okay, so let's see if we can get this to work. Next to the Wesleyan Chapel is a long green lawn space, and it's contained by a long green wall with water pouring over it. As you walk down the ramp into this recessed space, the sound of the traffic fades, and all you hear is the sound of the water pouring over the monument. The first few panels are blank, and as you move along the wall, the text of the Declaration appears. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. It says, the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. That's really powerful. Men have oppressed women always. There's a long history of oppression, and here are the ways that women have been oppressed. And then it's laid out on this really long wall so you can see just how many ways there were that women are oppressed. So I want to point out one line here in the text of the Declaration. It says here, he has withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. That line just screams out at me. Even at this moment of great potential in a radical abolitionist church, as the crowd discussed so many of the ways women are oppressed, the declaration they held in their hands contained a clear message that there was a hierarchy as to who deserved equality more. That white women should have the privileges of white men, not that all people everywhere deserved the same fundamental rights. So let's talk about what we just heard. One of the key things that Amended tries to do is both complicate the history and also debunk the myths that we might bring to our knowledge of suffrage history. So just tell me, how did you react to what you just heard? Is it different than what you thought? Is there anything that was surprising to you? Did it reflect anything in your own experience? Also, by the way, feel free to throw things into the chat if you don't want to speak publicly. You're welcome to just stick something in there, and I'll read it out for you.
This is something that has been fascinating me for the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years anyway. What did the Declaration of Sentiments actually want? Who got left? If you read it, who's left out, which is a lot of people, really. It is, I think, surprising that they thought up so many things that needed to be changed. And the repeated injuries and usurpations still certainly happen. We've come a long way, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, I was talking to my middle school daughter and a friend of hers yesterday, and they were working out some gender injustice stuff in their classroom. And the teacher had asked them in their classroom one of the young women raised that these are 8th graders, right? Okay, so my daughter's 13. And one of the young women in her class raised the notion that they had been catcalled and how that made them feel. And the teacher asked the women in the room, the young women, to say how many of them had experienced being catcalled. And my daughter told me every single one of those 13-year-old girls had been catcalled at some point in their lives. And I didn't know this about my own kid, which I felt bad that I did not know. She didn't tell me, she didn't share that with me. Yeah, that just sort of one example of sort of ways that repeated injuries take place, right? Yeah. So let's talk about the sort of expansive vision here. What are the good bits of the Declaration of Sentiments, if you're familiar with it, or what are some of the ways that some of the injustices that it wanted to tackle that you think are important or worth thinking about?
To lay an overall picture of this, these are the children and grandchildren of the people who formed the original Constitution, the American Revolution, and they're reacting to what are the failures of the Constitution and not being able to cover the interests and rights of people that are not provided in the original Constitution.
Yeah, and they use the language of the original Constitution to articulate this, right? This language, for those of you who don't know, they adopt the Declaration of Independence as a framework and use the language of that. And that's something that everyone in that room in Seneca Falls in 1848 would have known by heart, would have had repeated. Learning at that time was a lot about memorization and repeating out loud. The rhythm of it, the cadence, the structure would have been deeply familiar to all of the people in that room. But the addition of women at the start and the inversion of not the king oppressing Americans, but men oppressing women, that would have been startling and new. Mike, you had wanted to say something, I think. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think the thing that's kind of interesting here is it's, at the time, it's certainly a radical document, the way that it's put together, in that, they're using something like you mentioned, the Declaration of Independence. They're using something that is familiar to everybody, and not just the people in that room, but it would have been familiar to, I mean, I'm dribbling into my 50s, and I can say this, you know, I remember in 8th grade, it was 8th grade, we had to memorize part of it as well. I mean, of course, I went to a school, you know, in other places, but this was still public school. And so, I mean, even today, I know somewhat people are the average person would recognize this. And so by retooling that, I think that was very much a very clever way to do it, and to, you know, get people to think about, you know, how women were treated. I mean, it's not, you know, we're talking about a time when women weren't even considered individuals. I mean, they're the property of their husbands or their wives, or or have to be, escorted by a man somewhere. I mean, it's really, you know, we're not, you know, and a lot of this comes up sometimes when I, you know, have young ladies in my class as well. They're like, you know, they don't really understand some of this, and I try to explain that. But I think the point that is important here is this is such a radical idea that they're playing on this as a very familiar tune, a very familiar thing that everyone would be familiar with.
So let's talk about that ignorant and degraded piece. You just heard me read a portion of the Declaration of Sentiments, and it says one of the key problems is that women are not given rights that are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, foreigners, and domestic. What do they mean by that? What and why do you think they'd say that? What's going on there?
Well, I think that when you are trying to get people to pay attention to what you're saying and support it, you have to find a way that is likely to resonate with them. And here you have white, presumably fairly affluent women, and you're appealing to their sense of who they are and who the other person is, who the people are who should be subordinate to you, but actually have more privileges than you. I think it's an appeal to a hierarchical system, and we may not like it, but I think that is what politicians do. They appeal to the audience, and they appeal to their biases and their experiences.
I would agree with you, Jenny. I think that it's a very clear illustration of just how racist and classist everyone was.
Mm-hmm.
That was just the way we were. Everyone thought the same way, and therefore, if you can show that you are better than those people, why aren't women better than those people? Why should only be men better than those people that we don't consider to be as good as us or as worthy as us? Surely women are better than our domestic servants or the people in lower class situations.
But at the same time, you have to remember many of these women who attended this and wrote this, they were abolitionists. You know, they were seeking to abolish slavery, and it's almost like they're taking what they were seeking to confer for African Americans and saying, hey, what about us? We need to have, you know, be provided with rights that the African Americans that we were seeking to free from slavery, that should be considered to get those rights too.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm sorry, was someone else trying to speak? Was it just Okay, sorry. One of the really cool things that came out of, for me, of this experience was we went to Seneca Falls with Dr. Judy Wellman, and she walked us around and she told me all kinds of stories. And you're going to have to go listen to the episode to hear them, that I did not actually know about Seneca Falls. And one of them was that the Wesleyan Chapel was built by radical abolitionists who had split away from the Methodist community to form a specific site for their abolitionist work. It was a place where self-emancipated people came and spoke to the people in the region so that they would know about the experiences of the enslaved. It was if there was a radical thing going on, it was happening in the Wesleyan Chapel, and I did not know that about that space. I thought it was just one of the many churches that was available, and so people in that space knew to expect a radical egalitarian vision. What I think is so problematic, though, about this language is that, abolitionists weren't necessarily anti-racists, right? They wanted the end of slavery. They didn't necessarily want racial equality. And we're seeing that play out here, right? When they say women in this, who should have rights that ignorant and degraded foreigners don't, they mean white, wealthy, middle class women, and white especially, right? And that's something that's so embedded within the text of this founding document that it in some ways sets up the movement for the rest of its history as being about and for white women and white women only. So that's one of the interesting myths. One of the other tidbits that Judy told me that I did not know about was that there was a man named Thomas James who was African American, who was self-emancipated, most likely. He had a wife and a daughter, and he lived around the corner from the Wesleyan Chapel and was a trustee of the church itself. What Judy thinks it's highly likely he and his family might have been at the Seneca Falls Convention. They did not sign the declaration, so we don't have that information for sure, but he was extraordinarily prominent in the community. He built a business block that still stands. He became very wealthy and was a prominent, well-known member of the community, but was a trustee of the chapel, and that I think is a really powerful piece of evidence that maybe the audience was broader than we imagine it, and maybe it was broader than the authors of the Declaration had envisioned it as well.
You should also recognize that Frederick Douglass was a part of the assembly too, that that he recognized that this was something that he could support.
Yes, Douglass is a powerful advocate for women's equality for all women throughout his whole activist career. He's pretty impressive on that front for sure. All right, we're going to move on. And so if the one of the sort of myths about the women's suffrage movement is that it began in Seneca Falls and it was all egalitarian and that there wasn't any, it was for everybody, all women. One of the other myths that we grapple with has to do with the 19th Amendment. And that's something that we've been thinking a lot about this year. I'm sure you've seen some of the materials commemorating, often celebrating the 19th Amendment as having given women the right to vote. Dr. Lisa Tetreault is a historian at Carnegie Mellon University. We interviewed her because her book is called The Myth of Seneca Falls, and she takes head on what some of these myths are about suffrage and about voting rights. And in this clip that I'm going to have you listen to, she talks to us about the 19th Amendment.
A variety of people get excluded when they write this history. It reduces...
Sorry, shoot, I forgot to tell you. The reason that, one of the reasons that we center Stanton and Anthony and the reason that we center the history of white women in the movement is because Stanton and Anthony devoted 20 years to writing and documenting the history of the movement themselves. So they're 5-6 volumes called The History of Women's Suffrage. It's over 3,000 pages. It's an incredible resource, but it puts them at the center, and it puts white women at the center. And Lisa's going to talk a little bit about some of the consequences of that, and then talk about the 19th Amendment itself. Sorry to start over. Here we go.
A variety of people get excluded when they write this history. It reduces a really broad and complex women's political activism to the story of the vote. And it even collapses the story of the vote down further to the story of the Federal Amendment and Stanton and Anthony, when it was many things to many people. It also excludes a whole lot of African American women. Their story is not very well chronicled. Other women's rights activities is largely absent. There was a free love movement at the time that argued that women's bodily autonomy was the most important thing. There was a temperance movement. There was a women's labor movement. Lastly, it makes us think that this has been accomplished and achieved in 1920. Lots and lots of people don't vote in 1920. And when we say women won the right to vote in 1920, we erase the long and complicated history of race in this story.
Why isn't 1920 the end?
So when we tell the story about Seneca Falls, we concluded in 1920, and then triumphal ending, the promise of the vote, which had first been demanded in 1848, which in fact was not the first demand. And we're going to hear over and over again in the centennial that 1920 gave women the right to vote, or women were secure in the right to vote after 1920. But none of that is true. We pay scant attention to what the amendment actually says. And all the amendment said was, you may not discriminate in voting on the basis of sex. So in other words, states couldn't bar you from voting if you were female. But they could still bar you from voting on all kinds of other grounds. There were only two ways in which the federal government had intervened in voting. The 15th Amendment, which said you couldn't discriminate on the basis of race, and the 19th Amendment, which said you couldn't discriminate on the basis of sex. And other than that, states which controlled suffrage, which we forget, could continue to disenfranchise on any grounds they saw fit through things like poll taxes, which many poor Black sharecroppers can't afford, or understanding clauses were things that would say, like, if you're going to be a voter, you really need to understand how government works. So tell me, for example, all 56 county judges. Otherwise, we don't want you voting.
So let's read the 19th Amendment. Somebody who's brave, volunteer to read this slide for me. This is the text, the full text of the 19th Amendment. Nobody's brave? Come on, you can do this. It's right here. Y'all are like my students. All right, I'll do it. Okay, it says, here's the text, the full text of the 19th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. What's left out here? And what are some of the consequences for us today by the fact that this left so much out?
Wow. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot I had my mic on, but I kept going, wow. What's left out? Yeah, I think you'd have a shorter list of what might be included, because what's left out. This kind of goes back to that question, and I'm learning a lot today, because I was one of the things that always surprises me even today is that, you were talking about earlier, and this kind of brings it forward to this point, is that there's still some racism involved in this between Anthony and Stanton, who are, of course, white women. And then, it's what's amazing is that they're also kind of involved in this abolitionist movement. And then, the question becomes, well, how could you write such a radical art, write this Declaration of Sentiments, and then, it goes right to this, what's left out. Anthony and others become very willing to leave out their sisters, their African American sisters, or of any other race here. Because what's left out of the 19th Amendment are women. Well, what's included are just women who are white, because of the fact that, all law, and that's what most people forget, And we keep getting reminded in 2000 and 2016 that most law that regards voting is state law, and that the federal government only comes in and says you can't discriminate based on sex, you can't discriminate based on race, but that's it. You can discriminate on all these other issues, you know. Even, you know, and I think most things have been, since 1971, have been eliminated. But, you know, when you think it's only been since 1971, you know, with the lowering of the age of 18, there's a lot included here. I'll let someone else talk.
Well, I mean, it also means that yes, women and can vote, but it doesn't tell states that they can't have literacy requirements, poll tax requirements. If you don't pay your tax, can you vote? It doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you that if you commit a felony, whatever, you know, however minor, you can't vote in some states. I mean, it tells us who can vote, but it doesn't tell us who. It tells us who may vote, but it doesn't tell us who can vote. And I mean, I can't. It seems unlikely that these things could be dealt with in an amendment. I think they need to be dealt with in legislation. But it does mean that there are still many women who find it difficult to vote for various reasons. They're a long way from a polling place. They can't get anybody to look after their kids. All sorts of things that can happen, just minor things that can stop people from voting. But there are also major problems in some states.
Yeah, so for example, South Dakota, fairly recently, like within the last few years, passed a law that said you had to have a street address in order to register to vote, not a post office box, knowing full well that the broad number of Native peoples who live in indigenous communities in South Dakota on tribal lands don't have that federal infrastructure to have street addresses. So they often have post office boxes as their address. So it didn't necessarily exclude anyone based on race. However, the intent was very clear, and to disfranchise a whole group of people, to keep them away from the polls, right? So, you know, Jenny, you had suggested you don't know how an amendment could have done it differently. I've always thought very strongly that what if that either the 19th or the 15th Amendment, the 15th Amendment says you can't discriminate on the basis of race. What if either of those had said all adult American citizens have the right to vote? How would things be different right now, do you think, if that was the case, if that had been, if that's what the amendments had said?
Maybe, but I think the state can still put all sorts of problems in the way. I mean, just recently, Florida said that people who had been convicted of felonies could vote, but then it turns out that they have to pay any debts that they before they can vote. So you know that you get a little way, but then there's problems again. Yes, if you said all citizens could vote, that would have solved. That would have meant we didn't need the 19th Amendment, I guess. I think. I mean, I guess I tend to see the bad part of human nature, but I think that would have caused consequences in who got to be citizens.
Yeah. And just a heads up, episode 5 is going to grapple with the question of citizenship and voting for women in particular. We'll be looking at, I'll tell you a little bit about it later, but looking at Native women in particular, but also women who don't have citizenship in the United States, but yet are a part of this political community. What does that mean? Right? Yeah. Go
Yeah,
ahead, Mike.
I'm just going to, and just a quick question because I don't want to get too far because I'm glad you said something. I was going to ask, this came up in the Supreme Court case of Minor versus Happersett, where the issue, they weren't challenging, this was a case where a woman, I believe, was trying to challenge the whole issue on voting.
Right.
And it had to do with the 14th Amendment, but not the second clause, but the Establishment Clause, which had to deal with the issue of, citizenship, and isn't voting actually a right of all citizens. And, we're still, I can't believe that we're still in 2020 and we're still trying, Jenny brought the question up correctly that, we still, the voters of Florida rightly, bravely gave people those who had been felons but have, paid their time, they gave them, re-enfranchised them, and yet they're still being disenfranchised. And another thing that's coming up today that's quite disarming is it's very discriminatory against women, is this real ID thing that in all states has to go through that. And it's not connected to voting yet, but a lot of states want you to have an ID to vote. Well, okay, if you can't get an ID, this is very hard for women, especially because you have to prove how you got your last name in many states. So, that kind of goes in that direction too. And I like to see what other people are thinking about that as well, because that was something that was brought up in the 1870s, and it's still not quite. I'm wondering if it's any issue. I'm wondering what's the current status of that as well.
Dealing with felons, do they retain their citizenship once they're convicted? No, I'm not sure.
Yes. But I believe only 11 states disfranchise people with felony convictions. That number has fluctuated a lot over time, starting in the 1700s, moving forward. States go in and out of whether they disfranchise or do not disenfranchise or enfranchise people with felony convictions.
A lot of this depends upon the states having their own separate.
Yes, and at any given moment, a state's going to be on one side of that or the other side of that. It's very fluid. One of the things we like to tell ourselves about American voting rights history, and this is sort of part of our triumphant narrative of American history more broadly that I think we should probably engage with, is the notion that very few people had the right to vote, then more, then more, then more, then more, and now everybody has the right to vote. But it doesn't look like that. There's so much back and forth about this group has it, now this group doesn't have it, this isn't a restriction, this isn't a restriction.
So there's a lack of unity.
Always, consistently. Yeah, definitely. One of the key issues for me that comes up around voter identification has to do with transgender people, because if your gender identity assigned at birth is what shows up on your voter ID, and you go to vote and you don't present that your gender expression doesn't align with your voter identification, you could be challenged and be disfranchised at the poll because of that inconsistency around government IDs. Plus the ways that certain states are only allowing you to receive government IDs in specific places that are often rural and remote and very far from urban areas that have large populations and large numbers of voters of color who can't or may or may not be able to access that 2-hourly distant voter registration space. So yeah, I think that those sort of very narrow expansions that the 19th and the 15th offer us, I think are important to think about.
So this can be almost like states' rights versus citizens' rights.
Yeah. And I want us to sort of hold on to the notion that Lisa introduces here, that when we say that the 19th Amendment enfranchised women, it did not, right? We know Japanese Americans and Chinese American women cannot vote until the 1940s or 50s. Black women are restricted from the polls in the South for various means until the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. Indigenous women likewise, and even today. So that it give women the right to vote is problematic language. So hold on to that going forward. So the next clip I'm going to have you listen to comes from historian Betty Collier Thomas. She is a historian of Black women, and she is really amazing. And getting to meet her and to see her personal archive is sort of on a life bucket list checkoff that I got to make. And in fact, I've told other historians after they listened to this episode, they were like, "Oh, you got to see Betty's archive? Do you know how much?" In fact, Martha Jones, who's a historian of Black women, was like, "Do you know how much I would give to go see Betty's archive?" She was like, "You are so lucky." And it was really exciting to get to meet her. What I want to do sort of now is do what the show does. And originally the show, at the start of it, grapples with the white suffrage history and how we came to have this white suffrage history that we have. Betty helps us pivot to what's going to happen in the rest of the series. From that moment onward, we leave behind the white suffrage movement and start thinking about who are the other people involved and why are they excluded? How did they get excluded from the narratives? And let's pull out how they were always present and always engaged in suffrage activism. So Betty's going to talk a little bit about her perspective. You're going to hear me in getting to meet her because it's such a charming moment and just shows how amazing Betty is. And I wanted you to hear that bit. She's a really impressive scholar. She's written, her most recent book was called Jesus, Jobs, and Justice, about Black women and the church and labor organizing and their activism around that. But she's currently writing a book called In Politics to Stay, and it's a broad political history of Black women in America. So this is a bit of a longer clip. It's about maybe 3 or 4 minutes as opposed to the 1 or 2 that the previous ones were so far. But I really wanted to give you a sense of Betty so that you get to know her. She is our featured historian in episode 3. So if you like what you hear, go listen to that episode for sure. All right. Let's see if I can do this.
Because not only does traditional history center white women, but it also focuses on how white women were oppressed without acknowledging the systems of oppression they helped make and benefited from. To take only white women's stories as the whole history of suffrage is to ignore race, citizenship status, and class, and to pretend that sex was the only battleground for women's equal rights. It also means overlooking decades of scholarship by activists, writers, and historians whose work has shown that the fight for women's equality in America has always been as diverse and complex as the nation itself. One of those scholars is Dr. Betty Collier Thomas.
Hi, cutie pies. Aren't you cute? Thank you so much for having us. And a little taller than I am, and as slim as I used to be. Come on in.
My producer Reva and I recorded with Betty at her home back in February. She's a brilliant historian of African American history and a professor at Temple University. Betty has been researching and writing about Black women in activism and politics since the 1960s. And I think she's kept everything she ever found.
So welcome to Betty Land. Come on now. All right. I think all historians are pack rats, right? Because it's archives. Well, right? I have all this down here, but I also have lots of boxes in the garage. This is all suffrage. See, come over here. Anything one wants to know, I can write more books on this stuff.
Oh my gosh, look at this. This has got to be the largest personal archive I have ever seen.
It is, and it's the largest one on Black women, too.
Yeah.
Come on, guys. You got Betty talk going.
I do. I love it. I was seriously blown away. I've been in public archives that aren't as extensive or as organized as Betty's private collection. She has miles of bookshelves, cabinets full of microfilm, thousands of historical papers and photos. And many of the women who show up in her sources were lost to history before she wrote about them. We'll hear some of their stories later in our season. But before we dive into that, it's really important to talk about why it's been such an uphill battle to get the political actions of Black women included in the popular suffrage history. Or in other words, how the history was written to leave them out. Because we can't dismantle exclusionary history without understanding where it came from and why it looks like it does.
My first experience teaching in the White Academy in 1970. I received several evaluations, and one said, "She seems to think that Black history is American history." That said it all. They had been taught a sanitized version where they were taught U.S. history. I mean, this is what we're dealing with now in real time. Before, really, around the 1980s, there was no discussion about women in textbooks. Now, women get more treatment than African Americans, but they don't get a lot of treatment. They give you a couple of the names that are well known, but beyond that, you do not get the story. So I'm always adding things, which they don't always appreciate. And believe it or not, there is still much to be written.
So that's Betty. She's so cool. You gotta go. You gotta go listen to Betty on these episodes. She's really amazing. So let's talk about what Betty just told us, both in terms of thinking about how it is that Black women and Latinx women and Asian women and Indigenous women and LGBTQ plus women have been left out of suffrage history. But also sort of why is it, do you think, that a student would say to her, she seems to think Black history is American history? What's going on there? And can history do better? How does it do better? Lots of questions. Feel free to dive in.
I think the one thing I was going to say is, wow. She's saying this in 2020. And, I'm a historian, and although I'm not I haven't got all the fancy initials, but I've done a lot of the teaching. And the one thing that I think is so amazing is the fact that, she says that I think that says it all, that she seems to think that, Black history is American history. I'm like, I think that's stunning that we're even talking about this today, because the fact that there are people that, like she says, everything's been sanitized. There are a few people, even today, open up a textbook today. There are a lot of things that are left out that we don't cover, that, people, even today, my favorite line that I give for when I teach, because I teach both political science and American history, and my favorite one is every once in a while I'll get some students, but I'll get, because government's always the class that everybody wants to take. And there was a young lady one time who said in my class, she was stunned when I said, well, it wasn't even until 1965 that the discrimination effectively somewhat ended, where all men, women, and children over the age of 21 could potentially vote. And she was just stunned by that, and later she said, well, I just would like to go back to the good old days. And I always, I think my favorite line on that was, I said, darling, how far back do you want to go? Do you still want to be able to vote? Do you still want to be able to be your own person? And I think that even today, I think, what a lot of people don't understand, and even today we don't understand with what, there's a lot of lack of understanding, that there's a lot that we haven't talked about. I like what she said there. Is like, it's still, we still don't get it. We still get the very sanitized version. And even today, we're only getting the very sanitized versions of things like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, because even I'm not trying to say I'm, on any different plane, but even, some of the research that I've done, I wasn't aware of some of the racial issues that were behind some of the things with Anthony and with Stanton, because Anthony always publicly, at least, appeared to be much more an egalitarian. And so, I think that there's still a lot that's out there, and the fact that this is American history, and it should be taught as American history as well, not. I understand why it's separate. I'm not going to go with that issue, but I'm just saying I think we should be including it a lot more than what we do now, and we don't, and we should. So.
Yeah, Betty told us this incredible story, and you can hear it in episode 3 about some of her early research that she was a young Black graduate student in Atlanta in the 20th century, obviously the 1960s, and she was doing research on the evolution of Jim Crow laws in a courthouse, in a rural courthouse in Georgia, and it was segregated, so they made her sit in the hallway on a folding table. Where everyone who was coming into the courthouse would just walk by her and look at her while she was working with these historical documents. And so, you know, her experience having lived through segregation, but also teaching it and teaching justice and equity in Black history right now was such a really powerful juxtaposition of her life experience and her work as well. So why do we think the popular version of American history leaves so much out? Why is it so focused on one group of people in one narrative of one sort of happy, everything is great and we're making great progress kind of a story? What is it about Americans that yearn for that in their history? And maybe it's not exclusive to Americans.
I don't think it is exclusive to Americans. Every nation tells some kind of glorious story. I mean, I grew up with a glorious story of Britain, which has been complicated, I'm glad to say a bit. I think that the first thing we have to do is complicate people's idea of history, that there is a right narrative, that instead of understanding that history is what historians choose to write, which is certainly true of Anthony and Stanton, and what they choose to leave out. And that is always true. So if we complicate our idea of history, then that allows us to bring in other narratives which can complicate it. I think that's one of the things that we can do, and we can do in classrooms. We can have students look at the way that the narrative has, who's been left out of this narrative, how could it be different, and understand that history is not just one story. And you asked, what do you fear is being erased from our history right now? My big fear is that we will have no documents. My own area of expertise is in the 19th century. You know, I'm used to reading letters, newspapers, or lots and lots of documents that are left behind. Now, all this is online. That people don't even write letters anymore. And how are you going to get access to email and the huge amount that there is? I mean, about how historians in the future are going to be able to even begin to create a narrative.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that keeps me up at night, Jenny. When I was in graduate school, I was thinking about sort of pitching an internet archive for emails. But, you know, I don't know. Is it better now that everything is public, right? Like email is even, you know, my students are like, email, I don't use email, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So now we need an archive for Twitter, I guess.
Right, and then what are the implications that our historic documents are being housed by a corporation, right? Like, well, does Twitter own all that? What happens to that? Yeah. Well, Martha Jones, who is a historian of Black women in America and politics,
I'm reading a book, yes.
Yeah, she's incredible. She asked me, actually, you know, she was like, Betty's in her 80s, and we have probably 8 hours worth of an interview with Betty. We sat with her for a very long time, and it was so amazing. And Martha's like, what are you going to do with that archival tape? Because, you know, maybe 20 minutes of it make it into the podcast over the course of the podcast. And that's something else, right? Lots of podcasts are getting made right now with lots of fascinating people. What is there an archive for that audio tape, for that space to, and it's not even tape, it's that audio digital magic that, you know, gets made on a computer file somewhere. Yeah, what happens to that?
And who gets access to it?
Who gets access, and who's getting preserved and who isn't?
Right. Yes.
Is another really important justice question. Whose stories are getting preserved? Yeah.
I like what you were saying, Laura. Oh, go ahead, Charles. I'm sorry.
I was just looking at all the faces on that are attending here, and all the ones that I can see. This is all white group. Now, is there a division? Is it harder to get African Americans to, participate in something like this? I know for the 1816 Farmington Quaker Meeting House Museum that I'm part of, getting another group as part of our history, there seems to be a division between getting a diverse group in with whites. That's makes it hard dealing with history.
Well, I wouldn't want to make any assumptions about anyone's racial identity.
I'm not.
Right. But I think the question of diversity in public conversational space is one that's profoundly important. And I know it's something Humanities New York addresses head on. They actively cultivate space where people can meet and have civic conversations about things that matter, because there's very little of those kinds of spaces available for that.
When I do history, I try to include as much Black representation, especially when I'm doing Underground Railroad research, in my material, but it's hard to find because of the nature of African Americans at the time. Not a lot of them had the capability to write, and that their dialogue has been lost in history because of that. And so when I do find Black history, I really appreciate having that as part of my files. So it's some of it is the nature of history that you're dealing with African Americans who in the past did not have the capability of presenting their viewpoints and their suffering and things like that. There are some good literature out there, but the representation is harder to incorporate it into any type of history unless you have a lot of material to go to get the original sources from. So some of this is just the nature of history and trying to build archives and things like that for a group that have not had that sort of
yeah, sort of privilege, wealth enable documents to be preserved, right? That's one of the things.
Right.
I'm going to point you to episode 2, though, and I'm going to move us out of conversation and tell you a little bit more about the podcast and point you to episode 2, because I think it addresses some of your concerns, Charles, about documentation. One of the challenges, yes, of course, is to access the histories for groups of people whose documents have been less well preserved than wealthy white elites, right? And that's a problem across the board for all Americans throughout history, is that only certain wealthy white people get their documents preserved routinely. But historian Martha Jones, in our second episode, has offered us a way to read into those documents created by wealthy white people and extract and find the stories of people for whom they are not being documented explicitly. So I'm going to just, like, for the rest of the time, tell you a little bit about the other episodes in the podcast so you can know what you're in for when you go and listen to it. So episode 2, Dr. Jones takes us to the Homewood Museum in Baltimore that was the home of an enslaver in the late 18th and early 19th century. And she walks us through this elaborate preserved space of polished silver and china and velvet as she's talking to us about the enslaved workers who worked in that home. There is a degree of intense violence at the heart of this story and at the heart of American slavery. And Martha helps us find the stories of Black enslaved women and views them as activists, and shows us how the ways that they engage with with the enslaver, with the problem of sexual assault, with the ownership of their own bodies, how that's activist work. And it's probably it's among my favorite. I love them all, but this episode is so powerful. It's so powerful and incredible. So and it speaks to that the question of documents. How do you read into the documents? And I think that's a really important question for all historians. Our third episode features Dr. Collier Thomas that you heard earlier, Betty, and also playwright and actor Sharia Ben. And we went to Sharia. Sharia is a living historian. She embodies Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was a 19th century poet, novelist, activist. She's one of the most important Black women activist leaders in the 19th century. Sharia has spent her life of the last 20 years embodying Frances and living into Frances. So she helps us understand Frances. And Frances is our window into that moment of division in the suffrage movement, particularly when racism becomes explicit and a part of the suffrage agenda, as opposed to something that was omnipresent but in the background. So that's episode 3. You can listen to episodes 1, 2, and 3 right now. They're available at amendedpodcast.com, or if you search for Amended wherever you find your podcasts, you can find the whole episodes. Just a little sneak preview. You all are the first group of people to know this outside of the Amended staff, so this is a little bit of inside information. I'm going to let you in on what the next 3 episodes are going to be about, and who we're going to talk to, and who we're going to focus on. So episode 4, we're going to be looking at immigrant women and in New York City, and in particular, we're going to focus on 2 young women who were teenagers. They're in their late teens at the time they got involved in suffrage, but for whom suffrage was kind of a peripheral move for them. We'll be talking about Mabel Lee, who was a young Chinese immigrant who came to the United States when she was 3, who studied in, I believe, Columbia. She is very, very well educated. She gets involved in the suffrage movement in the 19-teens, and white suffragists are super excited about her. She is less interested in votes for women than she is in advocating for women's equality, both in the U.S. and in China, and she uses her power and her scholarship throughout the rest of her life mostly to advocate for the Chinese American community in New York, where she lives. The other teenager we're going to be looking at is Rose Schneiderman. Rose Schneiderman was a young Russian Jewish immigrant who worked in the garment industry in New York. She was part of the labor movement, and for her, suffrage was about organizing working class women and getting labor rights for working class women. And she uses suffrage and her involvement in the suffrage movement to advocate for working class women. She was an incredibly powerful speaker. There exists some footage of her speaking, but it's much later, and it's not about suffrage, and we weren't able to access it because the archive is closed because of COVID. It was so tragic. The FDR library where it's housed, they can't get it for us. So that's sad. But we have some footage of other young women who were around Rose in that activist time period, and her activism is really fascinating because she takes the trajectory of working class women, but she also then gets involved with the New Deal and with the Roosevelt. She's a dear friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. She's also part of a broader lesbian community of activists in the 20th century, and that's sort of a fascinating piece of her story as well. Then our episode 5 is about what are voting rights for people for whom citizenship is an ambiguous question, is something that isn't explicit or clear. And we're looking at the story in particular of 2 Native American women, one Gertrude Bonin, who's a Yankton, Dakota woman, and the other Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who's a Wisconsin Oneida woman. Both of these women were advocates for indigenous rights in the 20th century, and and they were also suffrage activists. But for them, suffrage was mediated. They wanted tribal autonomy, but also the right to participate in the American political system that was denied to Native peoples because they were deemed tribal members, not necessarily American citizens. So we're going to be thinking about the complications of that. We might also, I'm hoping, be able to tell a Puerto Rican story in this episode as well, because Puerto Rican women at this point occupy the status as a territory, U.S. territory, not as a state, so that complicates things. Then for our last episode, we're going to pivot to the future, and we're going to talk to voting rights activists right now. We're going to talk to Daphne Frias. She's a young Latinx New York City woman. She's a local elected official. She's a medical student at Johns Hopkins. She's a voting rights, climate, and disability rights activist. She's incredible. I'm so excited that we're going to get to talk to her. And we're also talking to Charity Rapati. She's an indigenous Latinx Pacific Islander Alaskan working on creating inclusive history curricula for young people and also on indigenous youth rights activist issues. So we're going to be sort of thinking about what does the future of voting rights activism look like? And what do you do in between election cycles is another sort of thing we're going to be thinking about. So we have about 10 more minutes, and what I'd really love to know is what questions do you have about what it's like to make a podcast? Any questions that you might have for me about anything, really? I can tell you one of the fun things about making a podcast that I had not anticipated was the need to record sound. So, I was thinking about it as talking. There's lots of talking. But Riva, our producer, is really, really interested in creating soundscapes. And you might have noticed this in particularly the clip at Seneca Falls. So often when we were recording together, which we haven't been able to do because of COVID in a long time, but when we were recording together last fall and last spring, we'd go to a place and I'd get out of the car and Riva would be like, okay, shh, get back in. Okay, and she'd hold up the microphone and I'd get out of the car and close the door. She'd do it again, close the door. She would record everything. She'd record us walking. She made me be quiet so she could record the water sounds. It wasn't something that I would have ever anticipated would be important. But when I hear it all put together, how important that sound is for both creating a mood and also conveying a sense of the space and the place where we are. So that's one of the things we're trying to sort of grapple with in our last 3 episodes are post-COVID. So we're doing a lot of recording. I record narration in my closet. I have a little tiny 19th century closet, and I have a microphone that's inside a cardboard box that's lined with acoustic tile, those sort of foam squeezy things, and I kind of stick my head into the box in my closet because we can't access recording studios, and closets are good because fabric dampens excess sound. So that was something I also never anticipated in terms of the importance of emphasizing certain sounds and then downplaying other sounds. Apparently in one of the episodes, if you listen really closely, you could hear my cat meow during some of the narration because he was mad at being shut out of the closet room. Yeah, so questions or thoughts about podcasts or about anything else?
Is there a way there's a certain segment in this podcast that it was hard to hear you, okay, to at least, to signal from the viewer to indicate that the volume needs to be adjusted or something like that?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, it was something that was happening occasionally after you'd play a clip. Then your voice would get soft and eventually it would get loud again. So I don't know if there's really any explanation for that, but you are loud and clear now and very enthusiastic, which is great.
I didn't know if this was something that you could adjust for, and that at least to let you be aware that you're not being heard, or to have, the signal putting your hand up to your ears, so to indicate that it's if the video is on.
I think what's going on is that Zoom is doing an auto adjust so that the volume of the clip is much louder, and so it dropped for you all the sound, and then it's taking a while to get me back up. But thank you. I'll look into that for future presentations.
Yeah, but if you have it so that the audience can put their hand up to their ear to indicate that they're not hearing, that if you can see it, that you can react.
I also sent a private text, so Dr. Freed did know this was a problem, but there wasn't anything she could do about it at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I got a question through the chat. Someone asked me to say some more about the artist who did the logo. Her name is Simonere Yoho, and working with her was really fantastic because she does really incredible both graphic design and artistic creation. So that's exactly what we needed. We needed both an artist and a graphic designer, and she pitched us an image that just had sort of random women, and we were like, oh, this is great, except it needs to be the actual women that we're talking about in the episodes. And so we went back to her and we sent her historic photographs of all of the women who appear, that we knew were going to appear in the episodes and in the future episodes. And so she transformed her generic people into specific individuals, and that was really cool and really neat of her to do that. It was also really neat to be a part of that design process, to sort of say, I like this one, I don't like this one, and what was weird about that little image or about that image. And it was also neat to sort of do that. One of the things we had to do was take, like, the image looked great on its own often, but then we would drop it into like an image with lots of podcast logos, so to see how it would look compared to other podcasts when you're pulling up iTunes to look at your podcasts or Spotify. And so that was really interesting to sort of say, oh, okay, now we have to simplify it down. We need more negative space, and working with that was really cool. But my favorite was getting the actual historic people into the image. That's a little secret too, that not everybody has picked up on, that these are the real people that we're talking about in the episode, in the logo. I got another question in the chat. Once you put all the work into the development of the podcast, how do you market it? Do these platforms allow you to post? That's a really great question, and not one I'm particularly well able to answer, because Humanities New York is really doing the marketing. So we have a person, Nicholas McDonald, whose job it is to get the information out about the podcast, and that's been really fantastic. One of the really cool things we've been able to do is pair up with other podcasts. So like Civics 101, I'm forgetting the other ones, but where we're using some of their material and then they're pitching us in other places. Likewise, there's been some advertising and word of mouth, and Humanities New York has a robust network of thousands of people on their email list that they communicate with, and that's been really neat. In terms of crafting it, it gets made and then it's uploaded to an aggregator, and then that aggregator shoots it out to all of the various podcast platforms. So you can find it on Spotify, you can find it on Google Play, you can find it, and that's part of, I think, creating a podcast is to make sure it gets out to all the platforms. Yeah. I have another question. What has been the response to the podcast? Do you think it's something that could be used in a middle school or high school class? The response has been, that I have seen, has been overwhelmingly positive. It may just be that people who don't like it aren't telling me personally, but generally people seem to be really responding to it very well. I would say, Donna, that yes, absolutely, it can be used in a middle school or high school class, and we hope, in fact, that it will be used. And Humanities New York on their website has lots of show notes that gives you background information that you can use in an educational setting with students. I would say that you might want to screen episode 2 first, because it is about sexual violence, and sort of make sure that it's appropriate for your particular audience. I would play it I've let my 13-year-old listen to it. I would play it for my students. I think we have to let people know how central sexual violence was to slavery. I think that's part of our American past and has to be grappled with, but it might not be appropriate for your audience. So just screen it first. But absolutely, the other episodes, no, definitely appropriate. And those materials that Humanities New York has on their website are really fantastic to supplement the listening of it. Yeah, definitely. Good question.
Well, it sounds like this is really a labor of love for you, something that you've grown up with and always had a particular place in your heart to advocate. And this is just wonderful. And you know, that artwork is so good that we can just listen and stare at the artwork, and there's always something new to see, even though it looks simple at first. So we are so grateful for having you. You're a very enthusiastic presenter. As I say, it's clear your heart is in it. And we have a lot to learn. I myself would love to take a listen to these podcasts and see how much has really been left out from public education.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. I appreciate the time that you gave to this, and it's really nice to see you all. Feel free to reach out to the Amended team if you have any follow-up questions. I hope you enjoy Amended. Go listen to it wherever you find your podcast. Subscribe, download, etc. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone once again for joining us. Keep an eye out for our next program. Let me see if I can get the name of the next program for you and when it'll be. We have on October 10th at 1 p.m. we have Vintage Tweets, Suffrage Era Postcards. That's with Carol Crosset of the Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum. And so we look forward to having you visit again. And once again, thank you so much, Laura, for being with us today.
Thanks,
Take care, everyone.